It's so hot and muggy today. I'm sorry if I look like I'm wilting throughout this video. In the 90s and the 2000s and okay, maybe even the 2010s, mainstream culture had this idea of anime as being like... Actually, let me just show you. Here is the back of a 2005 volume of Battle Royale that says it hits all the manga bases: martial arts, creepy old men, panty shots, without being Sailor Moon silly. Yeah, and Sailor Moon is what's silly on that list. The mainstream discourse was that anime was all sex and violence.
We're shooting this story with hidden cameras to show you what's being sold here. Magazines and videos so graphic, so sexually explicit, we turned our undercover cameras off.
And a little sprinkling of magical girls. But if you were deep into anime, you may have noticed some other elements. Was I an anime fan for the sex and the violence? No. Anime had something for girls who did not quite connect with what culture in the 90s had to offer them. For queer kids and weird kids. I was one of those kids who felt like the proper entry of anime into the West changed me. Particularly my writing and storytelling. My name is Lydia Foxglove, and I'm a fantasy author. Welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome. I've already talked quite a bit about the influence of JRPGs, anime, and manga on my writing, but I wanted to dive into it a little deeper because I feel like the broad cultural conversation about anime and manga is still missing some of the things that mattered to me. Of course, quite a few of you watching this are my people, so you know, and I look forward to hearing from you in the comments. My first encounter with Japanese storytelling, outside of like a few one-off cartoons probably, was Final Fantasy IV. For the Super Nintendo, or it was known as Final Fantasy II back then. That game blew my mind. I played every JRPG I could get my hands on for the Super Nintendo. When my mom went to the grocery store, I would sit in the magazine section and read all the video game magazines while she did her grocery shopping. In the 90s, the magazine section of a grocery store was amazing. You had GamePro, Game Players, Electronic Gaming Monthly, Nintendo Power. I think there was another one that was even more expensive that I never could afford to buy. There might have been like a Sega one. You get the point. There were a lot of magazines at the grocery store. So you could really keep up with the news because, you know, there was no internet. So it was in a video game magazine that I saw this little snippet that there was a Japanese animation called Sailor Moon that was airing on American TV at like 6 a.m. I immediately set my VCR to record it, and me and my sister watched it, and we were instantly hooked. Like, this is so weird. They travel into like an alternate dimension to transform into sailor outfits, and they fight monsters, and they eat Japanese food, and it's amazing. So we started recording every episode. At one point, we really thought that Tuxedo Mask had actually died, and we were crying. It was around the same time that we first got AOL and the internet, and all we wanted to do on there was look for Sailor Moon fanfic, Sailor Moon art that we would painstakingly print on dot matrix printers and like hang on our corkboard in our bedrooms, and of course talk to other fans about Sailor Moon. As a kid, I was in that weird space of girlhood where I was definitely not a tomboy, but I also didn't feel like other more girly girls. I usually identified more with the male characters in the stuff I was watching, but they were always like the most androgynous male character in the story. I was really into Final Fantasy and ElfQuest comics, but generally I felt like I really had to dig to find those little pockets of culture that suited me, and I just felt kind of weird. So when Sailor Moon aired, the Sailor Senshi are all 14. and I was 14, and it just like hit me perfectly. It was girly, but it was girly in a very different way than any of the other things around me. For one thing, if you were born in 1982, you kind of missed all of the peak girly shows of the 80s because you were really little when like Gem, Rainbow Bright, She-Ra, Lady Lovely Locks, all the girliest shows were kind of over by the mid 80s. They were replaced with like funny cats and funny animals for a while. And culture had also gotten very saturated with like Skater Boy, Surfer Boy, Ninja Boy. The early 90s was like a very like dude kind of time. Suddenly we had Sailor Moon and the Sailor Senshi were all different. And they all felt pretty realistic, at least through the lens of a 14-year-old. But then you also had these somewhat beautiful villainous men. And in the case of Nephrite, he even had a little thing with Sailor Moon's friend, and then he dies. You know, that wasn't happening in Garfield and Friends, even though it fell a little flat in the US because the voice acting was not the best. Molly, we gotta get you to the doctor. If there's one thing that this channel has taught me, it's that doing accents is not my forte. Then you also have the love interest, Tuxedo Mask, as I will call him for the simplicity of this video. Even though Sailor Moon was 14, her boyfriend had his own apartment. Now he was only supposed to be 17, so it wasn't like this crazy age gap. For some reason, a lot of teenagers in anime seem to have their own apartments. I don't know if that is actually a thing that happens there or if that's just some kind of like cartoon wish fulfillment, but anyway, she'd go to his apartment and they like make food or whatever, and at the time this made it all seem so sophisticated to me, like they're being kind of adult, but at the same time there's just kind of this nice slice of life quality to it. Like Lady Lovely Locks is not going to her man's apartment making a meal and that's like the scene. Lady Lovely Locks' love interest was turned into this dog for like the whole show. It felt like there was this intense level of reality in Sailor Moon compared to anything I had previously experienced, especially in cartoons. Like the characters had a rotation of outfits that would change but recur, as if they actually had a closet somewhere that they were picking out their outfit for the episode. And there was the cooking and the eating. There were parents, which a lot of Western cartoons either had dead parents or we just never saw the parents. You assume there's the parents somewhere, but they're not in the picture. All these little details are really resonating with me, but then we got on the internet and got the mind-blowing information that in the next season of Sailor Moon that was not airing on US TV, you meet Sailor Uranus and Sailor Neptune, who are a lesbian couple. Sailor Uranus often dressed like a boy, like a kind of hot boy. In America, in 1996, this was before Ellen DeGeneres came out, before Will and Grace. Like, not only were there not lesbians in children's cartoons, but even late night TV, evening sitcoms, things like that, barely had gay characters. No one was talking about any of this. It still felt very taboo. And then I find out that in Japan, they're just fine with girls dressing like boys and girls dating each other. Like, it's not even a big deal. It's actually kind of like a trope. So it was this whole list of elements. The subtle conversation around gender, the slice of life elements, the attention to details about real life, and more that I didn't even fully understand until I started watching more anime. Eventually, I started to absorb these subtle elements of Japanese storytelling into my own work. In 1998, I found out that there was an anime club at the local university. It was actually one of the most established anime clubs in the country at that time, and they had a pretty good library of anime. A lot of stuff that hadn't been released yet. Some things that are still not released. Once a month, they would show like a number of TV shows and one movie on a big screen. I saw Amazing Koku, Kimagure Orange Road, Rurouni Kenshin, Shigeyugi, Vision of Escaflowne. I saw almost all of the Studio Ghibli movies that were out at the time, even some that didn't come to the US for many years, like Only Yesterday. I saw Macross Plus, Macross Do You Remember Love? At this point, I was completely immersed in anime and manga. I was definitely in the weeboo zone. Not that we had that word yet. Like other people talk about 90s music, and they're like, yeah, I was into... you know what? I don't even know what was around in the late 90s off the top of my head because I was totally checked out on music. All I listened to was anime and video game soundtracks for like 3 years. And I already had my fantasy world before I found anime. It was already established enough that I wasn't going to drop it and just like riff off of my favorite anime anymore. I was kind of past that point. Now it was more about just learning more subtle techniques for storytelling or working in certain types of characters to the pre-existing story. So my story did not really read like anime or manga on the surface. And there were still a lot of other influences at play. Sitcoms I was watching, fantasy novels I was reading, but I definitely started taking in a lot of elements of Japanese storytelling. And throughout my career, I have realized many times that I've made it harder for myself. A lot of the things that people don't seem to get about my work, some of the things seem like, oh, these are the parts that I got from anime and manga. And we might finally be starting to be at a tipping point where these things are becoming more absorbed into Western culture, but I'll get back to that in a minute. The most obvious one is that yes, obviously Japan has a very different view of gender and sexuality than the West. And I'm not even just talking like gay or characters that you might call non-binary or that really experiment with sexuality and gender. But even just like casual androgyny that isn't even a big deal. Like this is just how the character is. They're just kind of androgynous. Like it's pretty common for an anime that is for boys to have some very androgynous boys. You can have the hero of a show who's like portrayed as some kind of badass, but at the same time, it's very pretty. Maybe even is voiced by a female voice actor. There is a somewhat fascinating combination of just characters just being casually androgynous and also having characters in boys' stories that seem like they're made to appeal to women. I'd say in America, it's fairly common to see a girl meant to appeal to boys popping up like in all kinds of things, but very rarely the opposite, especially characters made with like a true understanding of female fantasy. In fact, even shows made for girls often don't really seem to address what women really want or even what girls really want. Like there just aren't a lot of Western cartoons, at least before anime became mainstream, that have like a hot, tragic, beautiful villain man who dies trying to help one of the girls from the good team. I struggle to think of very many sexy characters in the Saturday morning cartoons I was watching. Like, I don't know how many people are getting hot for Skeletor. No, wait. I see you, username Bride of Skeletor 99. Someone is probably hot for Skeletor. But at least if you were a girl like me, it seemed like anime got me. It got the kind of character that I wanted. And it's fascinating to me how many of these characters appeared in things written by men that both men and women would cater to both male and female fantasies in a lot of anime and manga. I just feel like I still barely ever see that here. And nowadays, it's so much more common for entertainment to really understand what women want, like not just the standard male lead. I mean, we'll always have Han Solo, but you know, all the different kinds of weird that women like. Anime was like, you like an androgynous man? We gotcha. You want him to be a complicated antagonist who has a good side and is eventually going to team up with the hero begrudgingly for a larger goal? We got that too. You want him to have a tragic past? Oh yeah. You want him to have deep conversations about war and the nature of war and the cost of war, profiting on war. Okay, there's a lot of talk about war and fighting in a lot of anime, but yeah, he's gonna think about deep stuff. But girlie, you know you still want him to have a sense of humor. He's got that too. It's not so hard to find now. It's still so wild to think that I really thought that I had something deeply wrong with me psychologically because I liked writing about men with tragic pasts. Like, you guys, I was seriously worried for myself because I was writing the kind of story that is like the best-selling kind of novel nowadays. But it all started with anime. Anime was the first place that said, no, you're normal. Maybe you're only normal in Japan, but it at least let me know that these were feelings shared by other human beings somewhere on this planet. And of course, having Sailor Moon hit around the same time that AOL started to become widely adopted was like, because, you know, we could all find each other. But now to take it in a completely different direction, anime and manga also have a very different pace of storytelling than a lot of Western stories. So when I studied writing about 10 years later, I had a lot to learn to conform to expectations because I quickly learned that you need to have tension on every page, constant conflict. But a lot of anime and manga are a little more introspective than that. They tend to be a little bit more about the character's inner journey and the finding of a group or found family, as we call the trope now. And as a result, they're a little more tolerant of scenes where not as much conflict and tension is going on, because you do need to have the scenes where the character is being introspective, is reflecting, and is also bonding with the rest of the group and kind of strengthening the loyalty and friendship of the group. You can't necessarily tell a story about found family if every scene with the other characters is laced with tension and conflict. Sometimes they just need to be having fun. Sometimes they just need to be making onigiri. And this even pops up in stories that in the West would be coded as these action-packed, testosterone-laden, you know, brawler, girls not allowed. The Berserk manga, for example, was very much marketed in this way. We don't have our single volumes anymore, but like, it was so funny how the back copy was all like, this story's gonna slap your grandma and pour hot sauce in her eyeballs and spin her head off her shoulders. I don't know. It was not far off from that. You think that Berserk is going to be like this hyper-violent story about a dude with a big sword, and it is that, but it is thematically more about like the complicated inner growth of the main character Guts and the relationships that he has with his beautiful androgynous friend Griffith and the woman he loves, and him finding new friends and redemption and forgiveness. These are all pretty common themes. Loyalty and kindness to your friends. Those kind of themes pop up even in like very gritty stories or very sexy stories. So the emphasis is just kind of shifted, and this results in a very different vibe to the story. There's just more character introspection and more character bonding that comes across in a deeper way. And I'm obviously not saying that there are no stories in the US, the UK, etc. that don't have those elements. Like Lord of the Rings, for example, I think one of the reasons it remains popular is because it has some of those elements and perhaps even more that you can kind of tease out. But you do have to look for it a little more. I'm also not saying that one type of storytelling is necessarily better than the other. Storytelling itself is such a broad thing. There's so many little subtle elements that go into it. It's like saying one language is better than another language. That can never be true, because there's just so many subtle things that where language adapts to that culture and the way that you communicate everything comes through that language. Storytelling is much like that. It is a very broad and multi-tentacled thing that can express so many different types of ideas that you can't even always get a hold on it. Nevertheless, being exposed to such a different kind of storytelling and finding that there were elements in it that resonated with me so deeply had such an impact. But when I was trying to get published, it became a problem because Agents and editors would often want to see more happening. They just want to see a different kind of pacing. Certainly some of my readers have felt like this too. Some people maybe don't quite click with that broad mix of like darker elements, slice of life, humor, and some wish fulfillment all together in one story. I struggle to write men in a romance that conform to Western romance tropes. But it's hard to change any of that because I've been absorbing this kind of storytelling at least since I was 14, if not going back even to Final Fantasy when I was 11. And you might think, well, maybe you could just target people that like anime and manga, but you can't do that because the perception of, oh, this story will appeal to people who like anime and manga is still that you're either going to have magical girls, you're going to have martial arts, you're going to have mecha, some, tropey plot element of anime, not the more subtle storytelling elements. We can see that that is starting to change because I would say that like the cozy fantasy, for example, has a lot in common with anime and manga. Obviously, lit RPG does. We're seeing a lot more mainstream stories that play with gender and sexuality in ways that feel very anime manga-ish to me. There's all kinds of little ways that it's starting to pop up all over the place. If you also love Japanese storytelling, I'm really curious to know what you've noticed are the major differences between, well, I really could even say Eastern and Western storytelling because I know a lot of people are now getting influenced by K-dramas, Chinese novels. I'd be very curious to know what other types of non-Western storytelling has had an influence on you as a writer, or maybe you're just a fan. What sort of little things do you notice? And do you agree with me that Western storytelling is starting to show more organic cross-pollination with Eastern storytelling? There are also like other threads of anime and manga that I don't really follow, like horror, for example. I've seen other people discuss like the differences between Japanese horror, Western horror. If you're kind of following a different type, I'd be curious to know what differences you've noticed. There's just so many interesting things to talk about. And right after this video is done premiering, that's just what I'm going to do. I'm going to get in my Discord server that I have for my $5 Patreons and Substack members and discuss some of this stuff. The differences between Eastern and Western storytelling, or other country storytelling if you're familiar with any of that for that matter. How storytelling evolves over time and how all these things influence us. Thank you so much for being here and watching. I hope you found this an interesting discussion, and I hope it gets even more interesting in the comments. I can't wait to see what thoughts you guys have, and I will see you next time. Bye.